Gregor Mendel is sometimes referred to as the father of genetics. Let's look at his work and why he was important. In this lecture, we will learn how to explain from where an organism gets its unique characteristics, and explain how different forms of a gene are distributed to offspring. Back in the early 19th century, no one could describe exactly why offspring of plants and animals looked like their parents, or why traits seemed to appear and disappear, and then reappear again down through generations. Gregor Mendel was a monk who was born in 1822. He spent a great deal of time in the monastery garden, where he was able to carry out experiments into inheritance. He chose to work with peas, which are small and easy to grow and produce large numbers of offspring. Why do you think inheritance studies using peas is preferable to using species like pigs or horses? The plants Mendel started with were true breeding strains. True breeding or purebred strains are created by breeding individuals that only show one variation of a trait for several generations, until any other variations of that trait stop appearing in the offspring. For example, breeding only green peas may produce some green and some yellow offspring. But if only green peas are selected to breed for several generations, the yellow variation will eventually disappear from the true breeding population. Mendel's different groups of true breeding plants would produce the same set of traits in each generation. To figure out how traits were inherited from one generation to the next, Mendel crossed individuals from his true breeding strains to produce hybrids. Flowering plants, such as peas, reproduce sexually. Their flowers contain male parts and female parts. When pollen from a male anther lands on the female stigma, the flower can become fertilized and begin producing seeds. Pollen can be carried by wind or insects, such as bees, from flower to flower. Pea plants also have the ability to self-pollinate, meaning a single individual can produce offspring with itself. Although Mendel did not have our modern understanding of genes and alleles, he did understand that male parts of a flower produce male sex cells, sperm, and that female parts of a flower produce female sex cells, eggs, and that these cells join in the process of fertilization. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from an anther to a stigma. Fertilization is the actual fusion of male and female sex cells. Self-pollination is still considered sexual reproduction. While offspring are produced from only one parent, each offspring forms from the fusion of male and female cells. You notice about the flowers shown here compared to the flower on the last slide. Notice that in the last slide, the flower had both male and female structures. Here, the flowers have only male or female structures. The one on the left has male structures. The one on the right has female structures. Mendel removed reproductive structures from pea flowers so that only one set remained. What do you think Mendel was trying to prevent by removing one set of reproductive structures, and why? He was trying to prevent the flowers from self-pollinating. He wanted to be able to control which plants were being crossed. This diagram shows the method Mendel used to cross pea plants. He would take a brush, a small brush, pick up some pollen, from a flower that contained male parts and then transfer the pollen to a flower that contained female parts, thus performing the process of fertilization, thus performing the process of pollination himself, not fertilization, but pollination. Some of those pollen grains may travel down the stigma and fertilize that flower so that it can produce seeds. Mendel looked at 7 specific characteristics in pea plants. His goal was to look for patterns in the traits across generations. In Mendel's day, the terminology we use of genes, alleles, and chromosomes was unknown, so he just referred to the traits and the different variations of the traits. Mendel's first conclusion from his experiments was that an individual's characteristics are determined by factors that are passed from one parental generation to the next. Today we can talk about genes that cover particular characteristics and the different alleles that control the different versions of those characteristics. But for Mendel, he could consider only the traits themselves. What he called factors, today we call genes. The different versions of a gene that produce the different traits, for example, yellow seeds versus green seeds, are called alleles. You have a gene for seed color. You have 2 different alleles, one for green seed color and one for yellow seed color. Consider the characteristics shown here, seed color, in terms of genes and alleles. Predict how you would fill in each of these three blanks. Characteristics such as seed color are determined by genes. Yellow and green seed colors are determined by alleles. And the allele for yellow seeds is dominant to the allele for green. What does that mean? That the allele for yellow seeds is dominant to the allele for green. Well, some traits, not all traits, but some traits show a pattern of dominance where the dominant trait can mask another recessive trait. Think like Mendel. Imagine that you cross 2 plants, one with green seeds and one with yellow. The offspring of the plant produced only yellow seeds. What could you infer about the green and yellow seed color for traits? How would the results of the cross change if green seed color were dominant to yellow seed color? Well, if the green seed color were dominant, then the offspring of a green-yellow cross would have green seeds. Sometimes students get the impression when they consider traits such as pod color, or seed shape, that these structures themselves are being crossed with each other. The structures are traits of full plants, fully grown plants, and the results of the crosses refer to the traits shown by the offspring plants. Mendel's second conclusion is called the principle of dominance. Some alleles are dominant, some recessive. So what does that mean? We've already talked about it a little bit. An organism with at least one dominant allele will exhibit that trait. So if there are 2 dominant alleles, the dominant trait will be exhibited. If there are 2 recessive alleles, the recessive trait will be exhibited. But if there is at least one dominant allele, so even if there's one dominant and one recessive allele, then only the dominant trait will be exhibited. The organism with a recessive allele will exhibit the trait only in the absence of a dominant allele. Mendel's parent generation is what he called the pea generation, Remember in the P generation, he was dealing with purebred or true breeding traits, meaning that if he had round seeds, as we see in the first column here, the plants that had round seeds contained only round alleles. And the plants that had wrinkled seeds contained only wrinkled alleles. Well, he found that when he crossed these traits together, well, look at it. What does it mean for the trait of roundness to be dominant in the F1 generation? Well, if you started with all round alleles in the top plant and all wrinkled alleles in the bottom plant, cross them together, then that means in the F1 generation, he must have had one round allele and one wrinkled allele. But what happened to the seed shape? They're all round. They're all round. So that means that if a plant has one allele for round and one for wrinkled, then the offspring will have a round seed shape. It's not kind of round and a little bit wrinkled. It is round. The round trait is dominant, or the round allele is dominant for the seed shape trait. Figure out the pattern that Mendel saw for the F1 generation. What pattern do you see in the offspring? Well, all the offspring have traits of only one parent. For these 7 traits, we don't see any that are halfway in between the two parents. There are some traits that will be halfway in between the two parents, but for these 7 traits, he was able to see that dominant alleles would be the only ones that were expressed. So when Mendel crossed plants with contrasting traits for these 7 traits, the hybrid offspring showed only the traits of one of its parents.